Ah! Britain. The inventor of modern capitalism, the land of steel resolves, grand empires, and ironically, perpetual economic mishaps. Once again, we're staring down the barrel of yet another economic rescue plan. This time, Rachel Reeves, Britain's freshly minted Chancellor of the Exchequer, is on stage, performing what she calls a new settlement as she prepares her first budget, unleashing a highly anticipated and already critiqued package of tax hikes and increased borrowing. In true British fashion, it's being painted as another historic moment for the country, ready to rival the economic rebuilding efforts of 1945, 1964, and 1997. But here's the thing, what Reeves is actually proposing might end up more like 1976, where Britain had to go hand in hand to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, than those past rebuilds. With soaring taxes, heightened borrowing, and dwindling confidence in the global markets, this strategy seems poised to hammer small businesses, pile pressure on employers, and stoke inflationary fires. So, let's dive headfirst into this quagmire and unpick the real economic dangers behind Reeves' lofty ambitions. Before you start blaming some so-called unprecedented issues, let's be real, this mess has been cooking for a very, very long time. Let's track a few yet unresolved issues that have snowballed and come crashing full steam into this historic budget. 1. Post-Brexit fiascos and continued economic drag. Remember Brexit? Of course, you do, a massive earthquake that Britain hasn't quite settled from economically. UK's export competitiveness has been significantly undermined, not to mention the uncertainty it injected into financial markets. This has led to burdensome trade tariffs, regulatory divergence, and workforce shortages across key sectors. Reeves has inherited a brutal scenario exacerbated by the Conservative government's inability to right the ship post-Brexit. That has left a whopping £22 billion fiscal gap, a dearth of capital inflows from skeptical foreign investors, and an increasingly isolated economy struggling to right itself amidst global headwinds. 2. Austerity on revival, cutting while claiming to rebuild. The Conservatives spent over a decade imposing ruthless austerity cuts that gutted essential public services, from healthcare to education. Now, Reeves plans to reverse that austerity, but, funnily enough, through methods that mimic austerity's tax-hiking twin. Even as businesses struggle under post-COVID and post-Brexit weariness, the British government wants to sap more through employer tax hikes, capital gains, and even inheritance taxes that have spurred the wealthier constituents into looking for escape routes. 3. Skyrocketing cost of living. Inflation, driven by supply chain disruptions, energy market struggles, and global uncertainties, remains high. British households are suffocating under inflated grocery bills and battered savings accounts. The UK inflation rate as of September 2023 stood at 6.7%, one of the highest among advanced economies. Energy prices, while having come down from their peaks, remain well above pre-pandemic levels, further adding to the strain. Meanwhile, wage growth, though finally showing some signs of improvement, has hardly kept pace with inflation, further exacerbating the pain for everyday, working families, those very families that Labour swore not to penalise with tax hikes. The Labour manifesto explicitly promised it wouldn't raise taxes on working people. Unfortunately, Reeves' plan to increase national insurance taxes on employers immediately shifts the burden from employees to businesses, a change that's been rightfully criticized. Businesses aren't cash machines. When their costs rise, they typically either pass the burden on to consumers through higher prices or cut jobs. SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, are especially vulnerable, facing tight margins, growing costs, and an unpredictable post-Brexit market environment. The irony? SMEs make up 99.9% of the UK's business population, and they employ 61% of the country's workforce. Penalising them seems like chopping away at the bedrock of the economy, doesn't it? The hikes on capital gains and inheritance taxes would also put the squeeze on allowing wealth to flow freely through generations. Now, am I saying that inherited wealth doesn't deserve its fair taxation? Absolutely not. But these moves will likely stifle investment at precisely the wrong time and could push high-wealth individuals to move their assets offshore, exacerbating the capital flight the UK is already dealing with. Now, let's examine borrowing. 70 billion over the course of this parliament is no small figure, it's ambitious, to put it kindly. Reeves' plan involves redrawing the government's debt target so as to allow for that investment in capital projects and renewables, without breaking her self-imposed debt rules. Sneaky. Clever. Sure. But here's where the cracks begin to appear. Longer-term government borrowing is already under watch from financial markets. The UK's 10-year gilt yield has soared to 4.85% in October 2023, signaling that investors are charging more to finance UK debt. Borrowing large sums under these kinds of conditions doesn't just affect public debt figures, it jacks up the cost of everything relying on credit, from household mortgages to corporate loans. Reeves may claim she's making the investments Britain needs for long-term prosperity, but mistiming the borrowing cycle could lead to a deeper fiscal crisis if debt costs spiral out of control. Remember what sunk the economy in Liz Truss' ill-fated premiership? Investors turned tail when she signaled huge unfunded tax breaks, sending gilts into a nosedive. It's clear that the message of inconsistency terrifies the financial sector. Reeves has walked a careful line, but growing global instability from the Israel-Palestine crisis to the broader economic fluctuations in China, a major trade partner, means even cautious borrowing could have consequences. Reeves has ambitious plans to take advantage of the UK's potential massive opportunities in technology and energy. The expansion of childcare services and school rebuilding programs, including her proposal to create 3,000 nurseries, would likely relieve some socio-economic strains and bolster workforce participation. However, fiscal prudence is a must. The world has seen central banks frantically employ interest rate hikes to combat inflation. The IMF recently warned that global inflation could remain resistant to downward pressures, potentially even rising if supply restrictions are exacerbated further by ongoing geopolitical crises. The Bank of England, too, has kept its interest rate at a 15-year high of 5.25% in its fight against persistent inflation. Borrowing costs, in response, have risen sharply. Will Reeves' plan to borrow during such precarious market conditions backfire and raise the nation's debt burden to unsustainable levels? Financial markets have already started reacting. Between October 2023 and now, 10-year gilt yields have seen considerable volatility. From a high of 5% in mid-September, there's been some retreat, yet her aggressive borrowing plans could spook markets further. If investors perceive Britain to be a risky bet, it doesn't just lead to higher borrowing costs. It sends a broader signal that forebodes a likely run for cover away from UK asset-heavy portfolios. So, what's Labour's reaction? Instead of recognizing the impending economic turbulence as a cause for concern, we are met with boilerplate dismissals. Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson, championing her political loyalty, sidestepped sharp questions over whether targeting businesses would not also ultimately hurt working people. Such bureaucratic doublespeak would be laughable, if it weren't hiding such deep contradictions. Add to this the backdrop of a government walking dangerously close to breaking Labour's manifesto promises, and we have a serious political risk emerging too. Should Labour's core voter base feel cheated by the restructuring of employer levies or growing market anxieties over debt, it might ripple into electoral disillusionment, a political reminder that fiscal plans aren't just economic guesses, they're promises to the public. Don't be fooled, we're not merely talking about one country's economic headache here. The United Kingdom remains a major global economy, and its missteps will ripple internationally, particularly as central banks around the world engage in synchronized monetary tightening. Reeves' fiscal plan also brushes alongside fundamental trade questions. Despite Brexit, Europe remains the UK's primary trading partner. Yet with Britain focusing inward, the economic cloud surrounding the pound and UK markets adds to the growing divide post-Brexit. Weakness in UK business confidence and challenging export environments could hammer what remains of British power in global trade circles. International investors are already skittish about the UK economy. With a further potential squeeze on business profits and reduced predictability in fiscal oversight, we may see outflows from UK markets to more stable economies. In fact, foreign direct investment into the UK plummeted to £25 billion in 2023, down a staggering 70% from 2019's £83 billion figure. Reeves' hope of unlocking private investment may struggle to materialize if global capital finds greener pastures in more profitable, stable territories. Given the UK's reliance on foreign capital to fund its public and private investment projects, any continued outflows of FDI would likely exacerbate the country's economic vulnerabilities. This would also worsen the imbalance between public borrowing and private investment, undermining Reeves' vision of a partnership model between the public sector and private enterprise to stimulate growth. One particularly damning outcome could be a return to stagflation, that toxic combination of high inflation and stagnant economic growth. Reeves' borrowing and spending plans, while intended to spark long-term growth, risk fueling inflation in the short to medium term. If the increased borrowing spooks investors and devalues the British pound, imported goods would become even more expensive, worsening the cost of living crisis for everyday consumers. On top of that, business investment might remain suppressed by the rising taxes on capital gains and employers, preventing the kind of private-led economic growth that could act as a counterbalance to inflation. If businesses pull back on investment and hiring to compensate for higher costs, it could stifle job creation, leading to underemployment or rising layoffs, weakening domestic demand, and trapping the UK in a prolonged economic stagnation. Let's zoom in on the specific sectors that Reeves' fiscal maneuverings will affect most and how they could react. 1. Small and medium enterprises, SMEs, the squeezed middle. As discussed earlier, SMEs are the backbone of the UK economy, but they are also set to bear the brunt of the upcoming employer levy hikes. These businesses often operate on razor-thin margins and have far less resilience to absorb cost increases compared to larger corporations. The National Federation of Self-Employed Small Businesses has already expressed concerns that 60,000 small businesses could face closure in the next 2 years as a result of higher operating costs and a cooling UK economy. Simply put, SMEs may respond by raising prices, reducing employee benefits, or worse, cutting jobs. This would be devastating, particularly in an economy already grappling with workforce shortages. Labour's promises of investment in technology and infrastructure might help in the long term, but in the immediate future, many small business owners could see these policies as a crushing blow. 2. Tech and renewable energy, the prize or the pipe dream. Reeves and Labour have repeatedly emphasized that there are massive opportunities in technology and energy, and the Chancellor has outlined ambitious plans to pump fresh capital into these sectors. The UK has long aspired to be a global leader in green energy, with its wind farms and nuclear energy projects gaining international attention. The tech sector, especially fintech in London, is another area where Britain has shown considerable potential to lead. However, investment in these high-growth sectors will require more than just borrowing and public funds. Reeves' wager is that the government can catalyze private sector investors to inject capital into these critical areas. But will investors be willing to rush in at a time when business taxes are rising, market confidence is shaky, and the regulatory environment remains uncertain? The tech sector, in particular, relies heavily on talent mobility and cross-border cooperation, something Brexit severely complicated. As labor shortages persist and skilled migrants face hurdles, the tech industry may not have the manpower to execute on Reeves' optimistic investment plans. Similarly, in renewable energy, constant regulatory shifts and longer project completion times raise questions about whether future energy projects will be as economically fruitful as anticipated. 3. Housing and real estate, weathering the storm or going under. High borrowing costs and rising mortgage rates have already created tremors in the UK housing market. Borrowing spreads are widening, and predictions for 2024 are bleak, with property prices expected to continue to fall, particularly outside London. Rising capital gains taxes under Reeves may further erode incentives for real estate investment. Investors, both domestic and foreign, are warily watching the housing market amid inflationary pressures and falling demand, especially as average homeowners struggle under the weight of continuing high interest rates. New property development projects could also see delays, leading to a vicious cycle of undersupply and unaffordability, a sore point given that housing remains one of the biggest issues for Britain's middle class. The government's planned £70 billion borrowing for public works will need to deliver results fast, or the consequences on housing supply could deepen the crisis. The real kicker here, though, is the inconsistency. On one hand, Reeves is marketing this as a New Deal-style program à la Franklin Roosevelt in Depression-era America, designed to rekindle British innovation, prop up public services, and rally private sector confidence. On the other hand, underneath all that marketing gloss, we see austerity-like measures, squeezing businesses and the wealthy through more taxes while borrowing even more to cover gaps. Requiring businesses to contribute more through employers' national insurance would, realistically, act as a disincentive for hiring, essentially transferring the burdens of austerity onto the private sector. And the upper middle class, who are likely those best positioned to invest in tech and energy startups, could shy away from productive investments due to the increased capital gains taxes. What's more worrying is that if all this borrowing doesn't yield economic growth and technological innovation quickly enough, the next step might be deeper public spending cuts to avoid ballooning debt, a familiar tale from Britain over the last decade. Even though Reeves claims no public department will face real terms funding cuts, there is a hard limit to borrowing-induced spending without a rapid return on investment. Zooming out, we must also ask where the UK stands in relation to global economic powers. Both the United States and the European Union are pursuing policies that emphasize resilience in the face of global economic challenges. The US is countering inflation more aggressively with higher interest rates from the Federal Reserve and climate programs under Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. The EU is betting on green transition programs under the European Green Deal and large-scale subsidies to keep its industries competitive. While the UK has aspects of these strategies in mind, especially with its push for unlocking tech and renewable energy investments, it has less fiscal firepower to play with and even more uncertainty on the global stage. The UK post-Brexit is still struggling to find an identity, not quite a financial powerhouse akin to the US, not part of the EU's vast regulatory and trade bloc power. Thus, Reeves' new settlement, though ambitious, could leave the UK standing on shaky middle ground with higher taxes than the US disincentivizing FDI, yet without the strategic market advantages that EU integration still provides to its member nations. Rachel Reeves' first budget as Chancellor is poised to be a defining moment for Britain, but whether it becomes the rebirth she envisions or drags the country deeper into economic quagmire remains to be seen. Her fiscal plan certainly looks bold on paper: yearly $40 billion in tax hikes, $70 billion in additional borrowing, and ambitious investments in tech, childcare, and energy. Yet, as we analyzed from point to surface across the UK's economic landscape, this might be too much of a financial tightrope for a fragile economy battered by inflation, post-Brexit uncertainty, and global market disruptions to balance. The risk is that Reeves' package of tax increases and public sector borrowing could deepen the austerity cycle for businesses and households already struggling to stay afloat. While the long-term promises of investment in green infrastructure and technology have their merits, without sustained private investment and higher productivity, the UK's debt could spiral, dragging the rest of the economy along with it. Austerity 2.0, dressed up as radical economic rejuvenation, threatens to be the reality. Reeves may well go down in history for this New Deal of hers, but whether she'll be lauded or blamed depends on how the real economy reacts to these high-wire fiscal maneuvers. Keep an eye on the markets, the gig workers, the pensioners, and most of all, the middle-class businesses that keep Britain running. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the window for real results is closing fast. Can the UK really afford another grand fiscal experiment gone wrong?